Good morning and welcome to our live webinar on Ethiopia in Crisis, an analysis of internal conflict and its consequences in 21st century Africa. This event is hosted by the Global Immigration and Migration Initiative within the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, and also made possible by our co-sponsors, Freedom House and FIU's own African and African Diaspora Studies Program, whom we thank for their participation and support. My name is Ofelia Riqueses, and I am Senior Program Coordinator at the Havel Program. I'd like to welcome you to today's session. On November 4th, 2020, forces loyal to the former governing party of Tigray in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, attacked federal military bases, sparking a counteroffensive by the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments. The counteroffensive has been accused of great human rights violations and has displaced over 60,000 refugees to neighboring Sudan. We have assembled a stellar panel of experts who will discuss the ongoing social and political conflicts in Ethiopia and the neighboring region. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session. Dr. John Clark is a professor at FIU's Department of Politics and International Relations, and he specializes in the state-society relations of African polities and the international relations of sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you for joining, Dr. Clark.
Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be with you, and thank you, Ophelia, for that nice introduction. I think we academics and policymakers are alike are about zoomed out this time of year, so I'm glad that we have so many visitors and guests with us. Thank you and welcome. I know there's at least one former ambassador in the audience, Roger Meese, and one of the country's leading Ethiopia scholars, John Harbison. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished panel today. First, we have Ambassador Michelle Gavin, who is currently a Senior Fellow for African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Earlier in her career, Ambassador Gavin worked in the Senate, where she was Staff Director for the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Africa and Director of International Policy Issues for Senator Russ Feingold and Legislative Director for Senator Ken Salazar. Later, Ambassador Gavin was Special Assistant to President Obama and the Senior Director for Africa at the National Security Council early in the Obama presidency. She subsequently served as the U.S. Ambassador to Botswana with concurrent responsibility as the U.S. representative at SADC, the Southern African Development Community, from 2011 to 2014. Before joining the Council on Foreign Relations, she was the Managing Director of the Africa Center, a multidisciplinary institution dedicated to increasing understanding of Africa. And since I am an academic, I'm going to mention she was a Truman Scholar at Georgetown and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Gavin. Second, we have Professor Jonas Mulatto, Scholar of Ethiopian Politics and International Relations. Professor Mulatto earned his BA at Addis Ababa University, his MA at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, 2003, and his PhD in Political Science from FIU in 2020. He was previously a lecturer at the Addis Ababa University from 2003 to 2009 and a program specialist for the New African Research and Development Agency in Monrovia, Liberia in 2010-11 before he came to FIU. He has 4 publications in his young career, and he is now teaching remotely for FIU from New York, where he lives. Glad you're with us, Yonas. Third, we have Mr. John Timmon, currently the Director of the Africa Program at Freedom House, which is the leading research and advocacy organization seeking to advance human rights and democracy around the world. From 2014 to 2017, Mr. Timmon was a member of the State Department's policy planning staff, providing strategic guidance and long-term thinking to the Secretary of State. Mr. Timmon also served as director of the U.S. Institute of Peace's Africa program, leading the Institute's efforts to help end conflicts and prevent violence in Africa. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times of London, Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He was previously a Fulbright Fellow in Ghana, visiting fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and term member on the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition to his Freedom House role, he is currently a non-resident senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Thank you for joining us, John. Now, I would like to thank you, Ophelia, for a little bit of background on the war that began in November in Ethiopia. And I'd like to start with each one of you with a question about the origins of this recent civil war that began in Ethiopia last November. I mean, who do you think is fundamentally to blame for this war? Is the outbreak of the war surprising to you particularly? And anything else you'd like to say by way of introduction would be welcome at this point. I have a list of topics. We'll start with human rights after these introductory remarks. And I'd like to say that we'd like to continue the discussion for about an hour. And after that, we would take questions from the audience. So let me call first on Jonas Mulatto, native Ethiopian, to give us a little more background on the war, and then I'll turn to our other guests. Jonas?
Thank you, Dr. Clark, for the introduction, and also thank you for being invited to this really important panel to discuss an important issue, which is near and dear to my heart because I'm from Ethiopia and that affects me directly. And as we heard in the introduction, Tuesday, May 4th was actually exactly 6 months since the war in Tigray started. It was a surprise attack by the Tigrayan Regional Forces, the TDF, the Tigrayan Defense Forces, the Tigray Defense Forces, on the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Northern Command, and the response by the central government, the defense force of the central government, in a way that, so far it's been going on and there has been mass casualties and reports of atrocities and gross abuse of human rights. And we can say that in all corners, none of the parties that are engaged in the war are looking good, to be honest. And the central government is still portraying the conflict as a campaign to restore law and order, but it's already been 6 months, and it is degenerating into an all-out civil war with huge civilian casualties. And on the part of the leadership of Tigray, the TPLF, from being the leader of not only Tigray as a region, but also being a dominant player in the national politics in Addis Ababa, right now it has lost its authority, its power, and many of its leaders, including people from, leaders from the long insurgency against the Derg regime are, have either died or are imprisoned in Addis Ababa. So, it's a complex conflict, definitely, and a crisis of such magnitude. It involves multitude of actors with both local and regional. They have different stakes and interests going into the conflict, and it cannot be explained by a single cause, definitely. It's much more complex than that, but I will try to focus mostly on the EPRDF, what used to be the EPRDF, because I believe the current conflict, both parties currently fighting, used to be members of the same front that was ruling Ethiopia for almost 3 decades, since 1991. So understanding what was going on within the front, within that vanguard party, will help us understand the origins of this conflict, and looking at different inflection points and trying to understand their implications on the conflict that is unfolding right now. And, in Ethiopian politics, the distinction between what is party and what is government or state is really blurred. So whatever happens within the party will have serious, ramifications in the society. In addition to that, these members of the EPRDF, they claim to represent the main ethno-national groups in Ethiopia. So they, the conflict or the crisis within society is also reflected inside the party as well. So my talk, I'll try to keep it brief, which is going to be a challenge, but mostly on the nature of that EPRDF crisis within it. Well, the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, it's a front which was composed of 4 different political groups, political parties. The dominant force was, of course, the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, followed by the EPDM, the Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement, which later on became the Amhara National Democratic Movement, the ANDM. And later on, these 2 parties, they created the APRDF in 1990, and in 1991, the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, the OPDO, and the Southern Ethiopian People Democratic Front, the SEPDF, joined the EPRDF. And of course, the TPLF was a dominant party within the front. It was a kind of a primus inter pares, a first among equals, and it dominated national politics since coming to power after the Derg, the end of the Derg regime in 1991. And there has been some tension and controversy within the EPRDF with regards to that domination by the TPLF. The EPRDF was a kind of a consociational type of organization. Ministerial portfolios were divided among the member fronts and political organizations, but there was still three areas which were the cause of tension and resentment of TPLF domination. The first one is, even though the civilian bureaucracy was roughly divided among the political parties, the member parties, the military and security apparatus, especially the higher echelon of the military and security apparatus, was believed to be controlled by TPLF people. So that was one reason for resentment. The second one was, despite impressive economic growth recorded by Ethiopia in the past couple of decades, still the benefits of that economic growth, the belief was that it accrued to mainly people of Tigrayan origin and was within the state and outside of the state apparatus. The third one was, as you know, Ethiopia follows a federal arrangement, which is based on ethnic federalism, giving or devolving power and authority to the regional governments. But still the belief was that the central government was overly controlling and intervening in the affairs of the regional powers. And again, since the central government was controlled and dominated by the TPLF, it indirectly controlled, and there was no devolution of power, but rather it was simply deconcentration of power to the local levels. So there was federalism, but power was in the hands of very few at the center. So these three areas were sources of tension and conflict over the years. Now, since 1991, there have been some inflection points in the history of EPRDF, which I think are essential and which contributed to the shift of power away from the TPLF into the hands of the ANDM and the OPDO. The first one was, I believe, the contested and competitive election of 2005, in which the EPRDF lost significant seats in the federal and in some of the local councils. Now, as a response to this defeat, quote unquote, the EPRDF transformed itself into a kind of a mass party, and it increased dramatically its membership from about 1 to 2 million in 2005 to 7 to 8 million in the next election cycle, which was 2010. So the majority of these new members were recruited from the numerically dominant political parties, the OPDO and the ANDM. And many of the cadres of the EPRDF, many of the leadership, the current leadership of the Prosperity Party, we can trace their membership back to that transformation of EPRDF, its membership into a mass party. The second inflection point is 2012, the days of the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who was really respected within and outside of the front, and who did manage to hold the whole front together. And so that resulted in a period of transition, which was prolonged, and we can actually trace the current situation back to that. But of course, a compromise solution was someone from outside of the three major parties, the TPLF, the ANDM, and the OPDO, someone from the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Front, Hailemariam Desalegn, became a kind of a compromise prime minister from 2012 up until 2018. So that was one option, one opportunity for, that shift of authority and power, center of power within the EPRDF. But the belief that the TPLF was still dominant within the EPRDF, despite having Hailemariam Desalegn and Tigray as a prime minister, persisted up until 2018. The next point is the protest movement in Oromia, which started roughly in 2015, and to a lesser extent in Amhara as well, and lasted for almost 3 years up until 2018. And that was the major challenge, and that really signified the fissure and the division within the EPRDF in terms of how to respond and how to accommodate the demands of this protest movement. And finally, of course, things, Ethiopia was becoming ungovernable, and that led to Hailemariam Desalegne's resignation as a prime minister in 2018, and Abiy is coming to power. But again, although within the APRDF it continued, but still there were some issues that continued and that persisted. And one thing is, even though Abiy became a prime minister, the TPLF allegedly or reportedly was opposed to his rise as a prime minister. So it continued up until now, and it continued until the formation of the Prosperity Party and also the election. I'm sure it's going to come out in the discussion that follows what's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonas. And Ambassador Gavin, excuse me for broaching protocol, not calling on you first, but I knew that Professor Mulatta would give a lot of this background, even if it's a bit of an alphabet soup, and sort of orient our audience who doesn't know Ethiopia. But I'd like to call on you now to ask you, and good job, Jonas, I'd like to call on you to ask about your thoughts about the origins of the war or anything else you'd like to say by way of introduction, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. And I'm so glad that Jonas kicked us off, because he really did provide kind of a very helpful overview of the, if it sounded complicated, right, then you're absolutely getting the idea. The Ethiopian politics are incredibly complicated. And this particular conflict, I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I think it's very clear that there was miscalculation on the part of the TPLF, who sort of overestimated their military superiority, and I think made a very grave mistake. Equally, I think that the Ethiopian government is clearly to blame for launching a war on its own people. The conflation of the kind of armed insurgency of the TPLF with the Tigrayan people writ large that we see manifest in these reports of gross human rights abuses. There's plenty of blame, I think, for the Ethiopian government as well, in its bargain with Eritrea, allowing these significant numbers of Eritrean troops onto Ethiopian soil, a highly unpopular move in a very sovereignty conscious society. And then you can blame the Eritreans for their behavior, right? So there's blame to go around, but I think what's really important to hold on to here is, as Jonas described, Ethiopia is in the midst of a domestic political crisis that's been a long time coming. And at the heart of this really is a debate about the nature of the state itself. This model of ethnic federalism, where, as you heard him describe, right, you have all these different kind of ethnic identities being an organizing political principle, in some ways geographic principle, and how kind of tenable is that for Ethiopia? And that's kind of the big question. And it's a very hard thing to resolve, because in Ethiopia, even history is incredibly contested, right? How you see Ethiopian history depends on where you sit, but history is a very live part of the discussion. People from different perspectives feel that there are historical wrongs that must be righted. There's, contention around land and whose land is whose. That is a perennial source of communal conflict in the country. And I think, what I want to just kind of leave people with is that these are not issues that can be resolved by the elections that are slated for June. Not only are the kind of pre-election conditions hugely problematic, there are parts of the country under martial law. Tigray is not going to vote at all. Voter registration is lagging, right? This is not the context in which you really get an expression of the will of the people, but elections can't answer all these fundamental questions about the nature of the state. So there's a lot of work to be done. The other thing I just want to help people understand when we talk about Ethiopia And I think for people who've had an opportunity to travel to Addis, right, which is a vibrant, fascinating city, and you can see the evidence of lots of the economic growth that Ethiopia had enjoyed for many years, on the skyline. But Ethiopia is a extremely unequal society. There's, huge sophistication and a political class that is quite worldly, but there are an awful lot of Ethiopians who've had very limited educational opportunities. If you look at Ethiopia's literacy rates, they're surprisingly low, still hovering really just over 50%. So Ethiopia is not Addis. Elections aren't going to solve the fundamental political questions. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop talking so we can get to the discussion, is that when we think about this crisis and who's to blame and how to find our way out of it, you have all of this complex domestic stew, and layered on top of it, a lot of regional fragility, tension, and contestation. So it's not just Eritrea, right, which is the most obviously implicated international actor, but you've got a border conflict with Sudan. You've got the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a hugely important development project for Ethiopia that has got Sudan and Egypt worried about their access to the Nile waters, and some very bellicose language around this water dispute. You've got Somalia, where right now a political crisis that's happening there, which, by the way, Eritrea is also involved in, is threatening years and years of painstaking work, including the presence of Ethiopian peacekeepers, right, threatening this progress to try and drive that country toward stability. And all of these regional factors complicate the situation in Ethiopia, because you have a lot of actors, including from the international community, from the Gulf states, with interests in these different unresolved questions and sources of tension. And so the domestic crisis has to be navigated while simultaneously there are all of these other regional issues that draw in states from even beyond the region, kind of altering the conditions and the elements of the equation on a daily basis. So it's a very complicated problem that's going to require a lot of time to sort through, and a tremendous amount of skillful diplomacy and statecraft. So it's a very kind of high bar now that's been set for finding a way out of this mess.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think if time permits, we're going to come back to every single thing that you touched on, including whether this federalist formula is really the right way forward for Ethiopia, given the tendency of centripetal forces to take over, and certainly the regional context. So thank you very much, Ambassador. Very helpful. John Timmon, turning to you, I'd like to ask you to weigh in on this first question I asked about where do we trace the origins of this war and who's to blame for it. And then after that, you could go ahead to the next topic that I wanted to get to, which Ambassador Gavin also touched on, which is the human rights situation. I know that you'll be following that probably most closely. So on those topics, please give us your thoughts.
Sure, thank you, and thanks again for having me. Great, important topic to be discussing for some difficult reasons, unfortunately. And Jonas and Michelle have really done a fantastic job laying out some of the key dynamics here and some of the background. I would just emphasize this point about the structure of the state and really the question of how Ethiopia manages diversity. Ethiopia is an incredibly large, diverse country. And this structure of ethnic federalism was one means for managing that diversity, and it worked for some and not for others. Prime Minister Abiy has been clear that he would like to take the country in a more centralized direction and try to elevate Ethiopian identity over ethnic identity. And there's some some reasons to want to do that, but that kind of change doesn't sit well with many. And so, as Michelle said, that really is at the crux of the dynamics here and many of the complications. Another longstanding issue in Ethiopia is the trade-off between economic development and growth versus rights. And certainly under the previous EPRDF regime under Prime Minister Meles, there was a strong emphasis on the economic growth to the detriment of rights and democracy, and almost explicitly so. And there was a real belief at the leadership level that it takes a strong man to push through the changes, push through the growth that is required. And to their limited credit, a lot of that did happen. You look at the numbers, and Ethiopia has achieved very impressive economic growth levels. Michelle is absolutely right in that that is not equally distributed around the country, nor across political parties, as Dr. Mulatto noted. And it's worth noting too that a lot of the world bought into that narrative of Ethiopia, including the United States for a long time, I think, and was willing to support the idea that it takes a stronger leader like Meles both to hold the country together and to deliver that kind of economic growth. But the people of Ethiopia really pushed back against that in some of the protests that ultimately led to the ouster of the Prime Minister Meles's successor and the rise of Prime Minister Abiy. So we can't forget their strong desires for democracy and human rights alongside everything else. The other just general point I would make is that none of what's happened here recently is preordained. What's happened here is the result of real political mistakes on all sides of this divide. Clearly by Prime Minister Abiy, we can get into that, and also by the TPLF leadership who got themselves into a very difficult position. And certainly they are not to blame for the massive human rights violations that we are seeing in Tigray for the most part. But there is a lot of blame to go around in terms of how Ethiopia finds itself in the current position. And in that current position, the human rights picture is dire. It is hard to really get too many numbers in terms of the human rights impact. Certainly we're looking at thousands and thousands of deaths. But nobody has a great count on that sort of thing. We do have a little bit better sense of the humanitarian impact. Right now, roughly 70,000 people who have left the country into Sudan, who are now living in refugee camps in Eastern Sudan. The latest estimates are about 4.5 million people in Tigray in need of humanitarian assistance, about 1.1 million internally displaced people in Tigray. Somewhere between 1 million and 1.2 million people who have been inaccessible to humanitarians, and the discussion over humanitarian access in the Tigray region has been a very difficult and prolonged one, and the Ethiopian authorities have not granted nearly enough humanitarian access and not nearly quickly enough to humanitarian agencies who are trying to serve the people in need. There are some efforts to document human rights violations. There is an Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which has done some decent reporting, but some of it clearly with an angle, probably with an agenda. The leader of that commission is someone who is widely respected and a former Human Rights Watch senior employee. But he is operating in difficult circumstances because it is a government-backed commission at the end of the day. There is an agreement for that Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to do an investigation alongside the UN High Commission for Human Rights. A lot remains to be seen as to how that's going to play out and the details and how honest that kind of an assessment will be. So that will maybe tell us a little bit more about the human rights situation. And there's certainly been very good, extremely troubling reporting by some very intrepid journalists, by human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, others. But it is fairly anecdotal and limited, given the limited access. And I think what we're seeing and what we're going to continue to see is some very horrible stories that continue to come out. And especially if there is more access, then even more of those stories are going to come to light.
Thank you. Indeed, a lot of the news accounts of the human rights situation that I've read in the New York Times and elsewhere have been pretty hair-raising. All kinds of theft and assault, sexual violence, and outright murder going on. And the fact that the Ethiopian government doesn't want to let in journalists and let in human rights researchers is certainly troubling. So thank you for that background. Maybe I would turn back to Ambassador Gavin to talk about the international response to this kind of evolving human rights situation, including the United States, but also other major actors who would care about this, like the EU. Ambassador?
Sure. Well, I would say that, the crisis certainly in Tigray it's gotten the international community's attention. Whether the international community has been able to find any way to effectively influence the situation is another issue. But I guess kind of, ticking through at the UN level, you do have from some of the UN agencies, right? There's been an important set of talks between the World Food Program and the Ethiopian government around humanitarian access, which is still an issue, but they have been WFP has really been at the vanguard of pushing for more access. You have it, as John rightly points out, the High Commissioner for Human Rights working with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission on an investigation of what's been going on. And you did have recently the Security Council finally find its voice to be able to at least express some concern about these alarming reports of sexual violence and atrocities, and about the need to continue pushing for humanitarian access. Now, that came after multiple attempts to try and get just a statement out of the Security Council. This isn't some kind of binding resolution that had failed, in part because of the dysfunction now that characterizes a lot of the Security Council negotiations. And Ethiopia itself, right, continues to insist that what's happening in Tigray is a domestic law enforcement operation, right, and has been incredibly resistant to the idea of much international intervention. So, for example, when you saw earlier in the crisis, the African Union try to find a way to be helpful, and this is a difficult issue for the AU to deal with because, in part, Addis is the seat of the AU. I think the AU finds it challenging and delicate to raise issues about what's happening in Ethiopia with Ethiopia, and the AU tried to find a way forward last year under the chairmanship of President Ramaphosa of South Africa by sending 3 former African heads of state, Chissano of Mozambique, Johnson Sirleaf from Liberia, and former President Mulatta from South Africa, to see if they could help to mediate between the parties in Ethiopia. And they were basically sent packing by Prime Minister Abiy, who said that essentially their services were not required. And the AU, I think, has been largely unable to find a way forward since. There's been attempts on the part of the AU to get involved in the dam dispute and the water dispute that I mentioned earlier, which is putting a lot of pressure on Ethiopia. But the domestic crisis and violence, they're just not finding their footing. Now, other parties, the European Union has been quite forthright in condemning the violence, expressing concern. They have held up budgetary support for the Ethiopians because of these concerns. The US similarly has made a number of strong statements. There's been outreach at the very highest levels of the administration, from President Biden, Vice President and Secretary of State, reaching out to Prime Minister Abiy, to others in the region, to try and flag how serious this is. And I just want to step back for 1 minute and contextualize that, because why does the US care? right? And obviously, because of the horrific humanitarian crisis that we see, but also because we care deeply about regional peace and security. The Red Sea region is a strategic one. You're near essential waterways that are critical for global commerce. The potential for real state collapse in Ethiopia. You spin out that scenario and you have massive refugee flows that can destabilize a number of states. We care about transition and better governance models more aligned with our own view of international norms around kind of human rights and civil and political rights in particular. So there's a host of reasons why the US cares. And there's a real upside to an Ethiopia that's able to successfully navigate this period of transition. So there's been the appointment of a special envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeff Feltman, extremely seasoned diplomat with experience both in the US government and at the UN, who's out in the region now on his first trip, who should be able to help the US overcome some of the bureaucratic seams we have in our own system, where it's sometimes hard for us to see over the horizon to the important interests of the Gulf in the region. And the special envoy should be able to look at the crisis holistically and marshal the US government to be as helpful and influential as possible. But ultimately, there are real limits to what the international community is able to do to influence the actors who are parties to this conflict, right? Prime Minister Abiy has been very resistant and clearly believes that he can weather this storm. I think he's banking on these problematic elections coming up to kind of bolster his case and his legitimacy. The Eritrean government has long been particularly dismissive of international interventions of many flavors. And so it's quite, there's a challengingly limited set of tools in the toolbox right now for international actors to influence the situation.
Thank you very much. It's, I guess, a pretty grim picture overall, but I'm a little bit heartened to know that the Biden administration and you didn't mention the Biden administration specifically, but the U.S. in general, in the first 100 days is able to at least focus on this and think about the humanitarian aspects and the strategic aspects. And the State Department was somewhat diminished, I would have to say, under the previous administration. So that is some good news. And you did, on the Security Council, maybe we'll get back to maybe China's position on this, but thank you for that comprehensive answer. And following up a little bit on regional relations in Eritrea, which was where you left off, I would like to turn to Jonas. This was the subject of his doctoral dissertation, actually, Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa region. And for an outsider, it's a little bit surprising for a couple of reasons that Eritrea is involved here. I mean, despite the peace agreement of 2018 that got Abiy the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, first of all, the Prime Minister of Eritrea is a Tigrayan, I believe. Correct me if I'm not wrong about that. And second, despite the peace agreement, one can imagine the Eritreans taking a certain delight in seeing Ethiopia being troubled and possibly, falling apart, or Tigray becoming, autonomous or something like that. So maybe you can give us your thoughts about why, explain to us Eritrea's intervention in this conflict. Jonas.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Yeah, and as you mentioned, one of the first things that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, upon coming to power in 2018, did was engage in rapprochement with Eritrea and try to end the no peace, no war situation that lasted for a good 2 decades, since 1998 and 2000. And I mean, the fact that he was making that overture and trying to conclude a peace deal with Eritrea was a welcome progress at that time. But the extreme way that partnership and friendship between the two countries, but also at the individual level between Isaias and Abiy Ahmed was really interesting and unexpected on even Ethiopians. But in addition to that, there have been some other developments as well. Many people believe that Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia have created a kind of another partnership which sidelined and bypassed IGAD, which has been a main vehicle of interaction for Ethiopia regionally in the Horn of Africa. And again, that is something that has been going on, and Eritrea's influence right now, it extends in Ethiopia, but also as far as Somalia as well. Historically, one of the main reasons that the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia erupted in 1998 was the historical troublesome relationship between the TPLF and the EPLF starting from their insurgency periods. They did have some tactical partnership and support. There was definitely some support between the two, but there was also some areas of friction, which led to, after both of them assumed power
you
in
might
Asmara.
you might specify those as the two governing parties of Eritrea and Ethiopia.
Yes, so the Eritrean governing party was the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, that was engaged in insurgency with Ethiopia since 1960. That ended in Eritrea's liberation in 1991, and the TPLF being the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that was engaged from 1975 until 1991 and assumed power in Addis Ababa. So, there have been some strategic and tactical alliance between the two, but there have also been some issues in terms of, adopting an ethnic-based federal system in Ethiopia, which was rejected by Eritrea and Isaias, and we're not going to use that in Eritrea's case. And he was also critical of TPLF's use of highlighting that ethnic identity as a basis for administrative and political system. And of course, there have been some minor issues, also economic independence and the use of different monetary between Eritrea and Ethiopia that culminated in the war in 1998 and 2000. But there were also some, like intergroup dynamics between TPLF and EPLF, like some psychological issues. I don't want to go deep into the cause of that conflict, but there had, the tension between the TPLF and EPLF after the war ended in 2000 has been simmering, and Ethiopia and Eritrea have been engaged in some kind of proxy conflict in Somalia and also in the eastern Ogaden region of Ethiopia as well. So now, once the opportunity came for Eritrea, for Isaias, for his image to be rehabilitated and re-engaged with the world after a period of being ostracized by the international community, for his support to Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and also a series of sanctions imposed by IGAD, by the AU, and also by the UN. Now there was that opportunity to engage with the world using Ethiopia's Abiy's overture towards him. But again, that's, the level of friendship between the two countries, the two governments, was something that the TPLF, I wouldn't say like openly objected to, but there was some feeling of uneasiness on the way that, this new relationship was going on and unfolding. And as you mentioned, Dr. Clark, Prime Minister Abiy did win the Nobel Peace Prize for that peace deal and agreement with Eritrea. But right now, many people are saying, that was only a tactical move to isolate the TPLF and to be ready for the next conflict, which was coming up, instead of, but without going into the real reasons and motivations for securing that peace deal. Again, at first, during the conflict, the Eritrea's troops' involvement was denied both by Eritrea and Ethiopia. Later on, there was some backtrack by both parties saying, some posts and border areas were left open by the Ethiopian National Defense Force. So Eritrea's intervention was, the main motive was simply to secure their borders, not to assist in the conflict. Again, there are reports of, human rights abuses and direct intervention and involvement of Eritrean troops en masse inside Ethiopia. including, attacks on Eritrean refugees living in Tigray region as well. And what is behind the motivation for Abiy? Definitely, this is something that is costing him politically. As Ambassador Gavin mentioned earlier, Ethiopia is highly sovereignty-oriented population. So the involvement at the, invitation of the central government is costly politically and diplomatically, definitely. So why is the involvement? Probably it could be like military tactic, trying to encircle the TPLF from all corners, down from Ethiopia and from Eritrea as well. It could be that. And once Eritreans started to be involved, but they were outside of the chain of command of Ethiopian forces, there was no way of controlling them and making sure that they abide by the laws of war and conflict. And again, it's becoming really diplomatically hurting and tarnishing the image of the Prime Minister and the Ethiopian government as well.
Thank you, Jonas. It looks like the regional politics is just as complicated as the internal politics of Ethiopia. It's hard to understand. Going back to John Timmon, I wanted to ask you, Jonas sort of left off on domestic politics a little bit. Ask you to address what I think of sort of as the liberal diplomat's dilemma. The liberal diplomat's dilemma. So on the one hand, as people are trying to promote democracy in the world, we'd like to see the political space opened up, right? We'd like to see free speech and free political competition. On the other hand, when you open up the political space of societies that have been quite authoritarian for a long time, it tends to open up a can of worms that moves in unpredictable directions. I mean, my first trips to Africa were in the early 90s when the former one-party states were all opening up the political space, and we liberals were celebrating, broadly speaking, people who believe in democracy. But then some of those political openings descended into civil war, even in Rwanda, arguably, right? I mean, it was pretty stable under the one-party state of Habyarimana, or Chad. So I wonder what you think about this. You can also feel free to comment on the earlier questions of the international human rights response. But what should we be rooting for in domestic politics in Ethiopia, please?
Sure, thanks. I want to make one comment quickly on Eritrea and then go to your really important question. On Eritrea, we're all now having this conversation about their regional involvement in Somalia, in Ethiopia, probably elsewhere. We have to remember what's going on in Eritrea as well. And I know this is an Ethiopia conversation, but we can't lose sight of the fact that Eritrea is one of the most repressive, closed societies anywhere. And I worry that we may even be playing into some of what Isaias wants in talking about these external issues, talking about what they're doing elsewhere, and taking an eye off the ball of the incredible suffering that Eritreans endure, the forced conscription into their army with no exit in sight. And so that continues to need to be part of the conversation alongside the difficulties that they are causing throughout the region. To your question, I think your premise is right, and it's worth spending a moment too on the fact that there really were important political openings in the early days of the Abiy administration, and his Nobel Prize, I think, was officially awarded for whatever agreement was made with Eritrea, but I think a lot of it reflected the opening political space, a real reversal compared to life under Melis's EPRDF, and many Ethiopians were deeply appreciative of that. And I was there a couple of years ago and obviously got a very limited snapshot, but you could see even on a daily basis, the people were not looking over their shoulder the way they once were, and did not feel the sort of the pressure of the state bearing down on them in quite the same way that had happened for so long. Now, I haven't been recently, and so I can't speak to more recent dynamics, but there really was a degree of opening there. And as you're right, that when that space is opened, a lot of things fill that space, and many of them well-intentioned and some of them not. The policy recommendation that I and many others would make right now is Ethiopia would benefit from something like a national dialogue process. And that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But these types of processes have been implemented in a lot of parts of Africa, elsewhere in the world. And it's really an effort to bring together many sectors of society and as representative a group as possible to talk about some of these fundamental issues that we've discussed before in terms of structure of the state and how power is allocated within the state and how resources are allocated across groups. And to have a conversation like that that is opened without predetermined outcomes and that is genuine in the opportunities for people to have their voices heard. There's all sorts of complications to how you actually operationalize that. And so it's messy, but it's still a worthwhile endeavor. The Prime Minister has made very clear that he's not going to do that before the elections, and practically speaking, there's no time anyways now. I have real questions about after the elections, if presumably the Prime Minister, has a fresh mandate, if he would be genuinely committed to doing a real national dialogue process after that. But I think that's what the world needs to be pushing for in terms of getting at some of these more fundamental issues that we've all addressed.
Thank you very much. Sobering analysis, but some threads of hope in there too. I just want to alert the audience, there's a chat box or a box for questions and answers, and you can put questions in there. We'll turn to some of those after sort of one more round. There's actually one question in the chat box now. I wonder if Ambassador Gavin has a take on it. It's about Abe is an individual leader. What is his vision? Is he another Meles who was posing as a liberal reformer when he first got into office, and that was just a cover to consolidate power? Or do you have any read on him as a political actor compared to other African leaders? And also, maybe I'd just throw in my students reminded me when I was teaching a class 2 years ago or something. They said, "Well, Professor, the president of Ethiopia is a woman." So, and I said, "Oh yes, Ethiopia is that strange African polity where the prime minister has the real power, and there's a sort of figurehead president." But if you have any thoughts about the president's role too, that'd be useful, Ambassador.
Sure. Well, yes, the presidency is largely ceremonial, in Ethiopia, but in times of crisis, sometimes those roles can prove to be more consequential than maybe they were even designed to be, right? Because it's a platform and a space for articulating some kind of big principled ideas, right, about what Ethiopia should stand for, how Ethiopians should relate to their government, how their government should relate to them. So I wouldn't count out real value coming from Madam President. As far as the Prime Minister goes, it's a great question. It's actually a question I ask myself all the time, and I think a lot of people around the world ask themselves. I don't know that I have great answers for you. When I think about Prime Minister Abiy, it's clear that he sees himself as a visionary. And early on, it seems like his vision for Ethiopia was one that a lot of people could get pretty excited about, right? As John rightly described, those positive early steps that opened political space that seemed to find less threatening, a more open dialogue, even dissent. He clearly has a vision for an Ethiopia going forward that's a dynamic economy, less state controlled, and I think as well an Ethiopia that is a powerful voice for African equities on the global stage, which is also really welcome, right? Because there's no addressing a whole host of global problems without African partners, and you need kind of leaders to work alongside who are going to be pushing this agenda and can kind of clearly lay it out. So he's clearly charismatic. He thinks big. His vision is a large one. What are the other elements, right? How willing is he to kind of sacrifice some of his own citizens in what he believes to be pursuit of this vision. I don't know. How much does he believe that he and only he can deliver Ethiopia to the kind of promised land that he envisions? I don't know. I worry about that. How he understands this relationship with Eritrea, I puzzle over constantly. I'm trying to imagine what it looks like from his perspective and why this seems like a good bargain to him. So I'm sorry to be so not definitive, right? But there are a lot of unanswered questions, and it is clear, especially for students, right, of political science and international relations, and we spend a lot of time reminding people not to personalize their analysis and thinking about states, and the institutions, the history, the structural issues all inform a lot of what happens, but personalities do matter, especially in places with a fairly strong prime minister or strong presidency. And I think this is a situation in which Abi's own worldview actually is incredibly relevant and significant. A lot of people are spending a lot of time trying to figure it out.
Thank you. Definitely in the settings where, yeah.
And just to
Yeah,
add something.
No, I was going to call on you next. I was just going to preface to say where in these settings where political institutions are less institutionalized or less solid and stable, personality tends to count for a lot. And in the old days, there was a book by Jackson and Rosberg called Political Rule in Black Africa, and then it had a typology of different kind of leaders. So leadership definitely does matter. And I wanted to ask you, Jonas, specifically, what are you hearing from people you correspond with? Maybe they're mostly Amharic about Abiy. What is the vibe or the tone? What are people saying that you correspond with back home in Ethiopia about Abiy? And let me add on to that as the next topic, sort of where are ethnic relations headed in Ethiopia? I mean, Abiy is the first Oromo, of course, and does this war in Tigray signal more and more efforts to get regional autonomy or ethnic strife in the country? But start a little bit on Abiy's personality and what you think fundamentally drives him.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Yes, I actually wanted to emphasize his ethnic background, and he comes from a Muslim father, and he converted into Protestantism, and he's an ethnic Oromo. So the fact that he's from an Oromo origin and a Protestant to that effect makes, to some extent, it signifies the progress that has been made in Ethiopia in terms of accepting people, minorities, to come into places of power. In fact, his predecessor, Haile Mariam Desalegn, was also from an ethnic minority from the south, and he was also a Protestant. In fact, even like a marginal group even within the Ethiopian Protestant Church. And I believe from my discussion and from with my friends and from also following the news, that outlook also influences Abiy's approach to power and the way he conducts power, in terms of the belief and the self-confidence that he has, that he is a man on a mission, a person on a mission, and trying to take Ethiopia out of this quagmire, of underdevelopment and political problem as well. And notably, he called when EPRDF, when the 4 different parties were merged into one political party and it evolved into one political party, of course, the TPLF rejected that and they left the EPRDF and they continued on their own, ruling Tigray. That was back in 2019. So when EPRDF became a party instead of a front of different groups, the name that was given to it was Prosperity Party, the Ethiopian Prosperity Party. And for some people, again, that signifies his outlook, the influence of religion to his outlook as well. We know about the prosperity gospel that goes on in Western countries and in America. And the way, his rhetoric of the way that he uses language, as if it, like a preacher, quite different from the way that Meles, the late prime minister, was, conducting his affairs and communicating with the people. But in addition to that, also to mention the role of the presidency. It's not only the president who's a woman, of course, and when Abiy came to power and he first introduced his cabinet, 50% of the cabinet members were women as well. And that also was a positive coverage in the international media, that Ethiopia, I think probably next to Rwanda, and having like a significant number of women participating in government and in decision-making. But again, that role that the president plays, more of ceremonial, indeed it is, but it's also something that I think Prime Minister Abiy also enjoys. He's not only the head of government, but he's also involved in ceremonies and going to places and showing his being like a head of state more than a head of government. And the transformation of the Ethiopian system from a parliamentary to a presidential system with a head of state and the head of government fused on one person and on one office, something that has been mooted among the political circles, and it is believed that Abiy prefers to have a presidential system as well, just as in the rest of Africa as well. But again, it's hard to verify that information, definitely. But the fact that he comes from an Oromo background, a minority, is a source of unifying the country, although he is ethnic Oromo, but his rhetoric is unifying, and he highlights Ethiopian nationalism highly. And again, that is a source of strength, but it also a source of criticism for him. For Amara ultra-nationalists, he's just an Oromo trying to use Ethiopian nationalism as a cover, but advancing the interest of his own ethnic groups. But for ultra-Oromo nationalists, he's a sellout, okay? Because he focuses more on the Ethiopian history. So, I mean, there is that tension coming from different groups, from the polarized Ethiopian political groups, and that is a source of problem for him as well. In terms of the ethnic relations, in some quarters, there is a tendency to view the conflict as the TPLF, a champion of the rights of ethnic groups in different regions, and trying to maintain the ethno-national based federal system, while the central government led by Prime Minister Abiy actually trying to curb the influence of ethno-regional parties and limit the powers of the regions, including Tigray. In fact, one of the main reasons many attribute the conflict to is that Abiy is trying to control Tigray after dislodging TPLF from power, but TPLF is fighting back, and it's they're trying to forge a kind of an alliance with other ethno-national groups operating in different parts of Ethiopia. But there is tension, although our discussion has focused on the conflict in Tigray, there are many conflicts and loss of life and attacks on different ethnic groups in the Amara region, in the Oromia region, in Benishangul Gumuz region as well, where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is located. Also in some parts of Somali, Afar, and the Southern Ethiopian people region as well. So we see all these problems appearing in different parts of the country, which shows the magnitude of challenge that Ethiopia faces now. And as Mr. Temmon said, something that has to be discussed and decided by a national dialogue, even after the election and its outcomes in June. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. You all are reading my mind, leaving off right where I want to go next. I'm bringing in some questions from the chat box into my own questions here, so those who wrote them there will see that. John Timmon I was intrigued also when you mentioned the possibility of a national dialogue. This was a formula that was used across Francophone Africa. I'm a student of Francophone Africa in the early 90s. All of the virtually every Francophone country that was opened up the political space had a national conference. In the parts of Africa that were predominantly Christian, it would usually be a leading Catholic prelate who would, preside over that. In the Muslim places, it was also religious figures. So I guess my question for you is, if there were to be a national conference in Ethiopia, to bring together all the leading personalities, figures representing different interest groups. What can you envision any kind of formula that will deal with these cleavages of society? Jonas was just talking about primarily about the ethnic ones, and that was in the question in the box, but also the religious cleavages. I mean, there's this very interesting phenomenon of growing Pentecostalism in Ethiopia as there is in other places of Africa. And just one more preambulatory comment, sorry. But one thing that's always I found a little bit heartening about Ethiopia in prior times was the lack of conflict between Christians and Muslims in the period where the Orthodox Christians really ran the country. And I hope that we won't start to see religious conflict growing on top of the ethnic conflict. But anyway, my question is, like, what kind of formula coming out of a national conference would you see as most promising for containing all of these forces that could rip the country apart? Tough question, I know.
No, it's a really good question. Let me get to that in one moment. I wanted to return just briefly to a point that Michelle made, just to really emphasize it, which is the tendency that so many of us have to celebrate new leaders when they come into office and make some of these really positive early reforms and seem to be so different from their predecessor. And the narrative that develops around that, and I look back at some of what I wrote and said in those early days and think maybe I contributed to that too. And again, some of that progress was real, but we are learning this lesson yet again in terms of the personalization of these issues and in terms of our relationships. And I think the U.S. government, if folks are honest with themselves, put Abiy too much at the center of everything and put too many eggs in his basket and are paying some of the price for that now. On your question on national dialogue, there are many people out there who are more expert than I am on this. And fundamentally, it's the role of Ethiopians to define what these processes look, to set the agenda, to identify who needs to participate. And we really need to be careful in terms of outside influence on that. But what I think is the role of outsiders is to really articulate sort of broad parameters of what good practice looks like in these sorts of processes. And as you know, there's a lot of examples, especially the Francophone West Africa ones, of where things have worked and where things haven't worked. More recently, Sudan has tried to do these things, not in an effective manner. There's a lot of what not to do from just over the border there. And I think part of the role for Westerners too is also to help to facilitate that learning of, cross-country learning as to what has worked elsewhere. And there's all sorts of ways to do that with sort of study exchanges and that kind of thing. That's where I think we need to be investing right now. One point I would emphasize is a really strong civil society voice in any kind of conversation like that, and not just having it be the people with power who are at the table. Ethiopia's civil society has really been hurt over many years, particularly of oppressive legislation around civil society under Meles. They are slowly starting to come back and rebuild themselves. But even in their sort of weakened state, those voices still need to be central to any conversation like that.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. In Francophone Africa, one of the formulations that often came out was they often adopted a kind of French Fifth Republic model where you had power divided between a president and a prime minister, and that does seem to be. That seems to work in Ethiopia, where the president's role is somewhat circumscribed and limited. It worked out very badly institutionally in Francophone Africa and Niger and Congo Brazzaville, many other places there. I mean, they even in France, they have some difficulty sometimes managing relations between the president and prime minister. So those formulas matter. I think we're at the moment where I can sort of give everybody a last word of anything you wanted to say. There was a a recent article in The Economist about how this war is threatening the sort of economic miracle of Ethiopia, which Jonas has sometimes told me privately that it was a little bit overstated in the statistics and in the press, the Ethiopia economic miracle. But there is good evidence that food insecurity has gone down quite a lot, and some of the indicators, life expectancy, and even things like the age of marriage for girls used to be depressingly sort of low in Ethiopia. So many of the social and economic indicators have been improving over the last 25 years. So that's another one concern I have, as everyone does, whether this can continue. But I'd like to just ask each one of you for any final thoughts. Ambassador Gavin, I turn to you. Yours may be more on sort of what the diplomatic community can do, the international community can do to help more at this point. But let me just give you a chance for a final word on the economics or diplomacy or anything you prefer.
Sure. Well, I guess, it's been such a great conversation, and where it leaves me is that while this is an incredibly complex set of issues, some of which can only be resolved by the Ethiopian people, right? There's good reason to kind of stay with the problem and not let things go further off the rails than they already have. There is the potential to do what John was talking about and create, the scaffolding and structure around which there's a space for Ethiopians to raise these issues. And it's both about the kind of form and structure of government, as you alluded to, but there are some other, I think, important issues on the table for Ethiopians around land tenure and other pieces that perhaps need to be addressed. And the key thing is to get everybody to buy into a rule-governed, peaceful system for finding ways to address these tensions. And that means that system has to be credible and have integrity, right? Nobody's interested in giving up all their other options to be part of kind of a play acting exercise. And there are things the international community can do to build that kind of trust. And the final thing I would say is that the excellent point that John made about Eritrea, let us not forget the plight of the Eritrean people, right, is also, I think, going to be really important as these regional crises spin out, as the prospect of interstate conflict over water issues, over the border with Sudan. There's any number of potential irritants coming out of Somalia that could spark that kind of conflict. As all of that unfolds, it's going to be critical to remember that a solution that just seems to kind of put a lid on the tension but does nothing to address the legitimate needs of the Ethiopian people, right? And their desires and a way for them to find expression isn't going to be lasting or effective. So it's going to be a balancing act to be sure to, by all means, de-escalate these international crises, but never to lose sight of the importance of kind of this domestic political process. Because if we're ever going to get to the Ethiopia that everyone was so excited about in those early days of Prime Minister Abiy's government, those are issues have to get addressed.
Thank you very much. Maybe the international community needs to be more circumspect about giving out Nobel Prizes too early in the process. Jonas, just for a last word for you in just a minute or two, Ambassador Gavin, it may not have been what she was thinking, but it was what she made me think, is this kind of perpetual discussion we have about political culture versus institutions. So John Timmon was talking about the different kind of institutions that might, or I was inviting him to talk about the kind of institutions that might come out of a national dialogue kind of process. But does it really matter what the institutional setup is if the political culture is fundamentally authoritarian? And what I fear about this war, aside from the grave humanitarian impacts that it has immediately, is it's going to erode any kind of democratic elements of the polity that were in the political culture of Ethiopia that were emerging. If you have just a thought or two on that, I'd be grateful.
Yeah. With regards to the question of national dialogue, I also believe it's something that really needs to be done, and including the question of, I think one of the fundamental question is that the formation of the Ethiopian state, how it evolved from one which was relatively homogeneous, concentrated in the northern and central highlands, expanding into the lowlands and some of the highlands in the south and in the southwest, incorporating diverse people. To some extent, the ethnic based federalism that was instituted in 1991 and in 1995 addressed some of the issues in terms of accepting the cultural and linguistic autonomy of different ethnic groups and giving them recognition as well. And also in terms of local representation of different minority ethnic groups and self-administration as well. So that to some extent addressed the political issue and the conflict issue that was festering in Ethiopia. That laid the foundation for a successful economic transformation. I wouldn't call it transformation, but economic growth. But of course, the economic growth was not equitable, and that became an impetus to the protest movement and also the Prime Minister Abiy's coming to power. But national dialogue would be ideal to discuss these things, to discuss constitutional issues, how to reconcile the centrifugal tendencies of ethno-national sentiments with the centripetal ideas of Ethiopian nationalism, how to mediate between these two competing types of nationalisms, Ethiopian and ethno-national, nationalism, so to speak. And that would be essential, but I'm probably a bit pessimistic about it. There has to be some impetus to it, right? There has to be some sense that forces the people in power now to come to a dialogue, to come to the negotiating table as well, which I don't see right now. In fact, just today, the Ethiopian parliament passed a law designating the TPLF and one faction of the OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, as terrorist groups and shutting the possibility for any sort of negotiated settlement. So as things stand now, I don't see that possibility for national dialogue, but I would believe even after the election and its outcomes, it is something that can be done. But again, that it can come from the civil society, just as it happened in Sudan, the movement of different professional groups. It could come from that, but the absence of unorganized and independent civil society in Ethiopia, the absence of that political culture of compromise and accepting different opinions, and the belief that power is always a zero-sum game among the political elites is going to impede the possibility of a national dialogue in addressing the Ethiopian problems, the roots of the problems that Ethiopia faces.
Thank you, Jonas. John, you're going to have the last word today, and there's about 6 different issues still on the table, from the economy to the national dialogue to the way forward. And there was a question in the chat box about refugees in Sudan, and I did see articles about that, actually, how Muslims in Sudan were hosting their fellow Muslims without any coordination from the UNHCR or international organizations, just on a kind of a personal basis, like helping people get some food and shelter in the parts of Sudan where they're refugees. But so you could address that, but also maybe whether the international community should put pressure on Abiy to hold a kind of national dialogue in the country, or anything else you like to comment on.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's a lot there. Maybe just quickly on a few points. On refugees, yes, about 70,000 or so people now living in Eastern Sudan, and that's a pretty desolate, difficult part of Sudan. Services really are very limited. I think Sudan has done well and done what they can in terms of supporting people, but Sudan doesn't have a whole lot of resources. and there's been an international response, and there's much more access on that side of the border than there is on the Ethiopia side of the border, unfortunately. But no doubt those are very difficult circumstances that people are living in there, and I'm sure many of those people are wanting to return and are also wondering about the fate of many family members on the Ethiopia side, because at various points the Ethiopian government has tried to close that border, limiting additional refugees crossing over. On the economy, one interesting data point on that is the privatization of Ethiopia Telecom, which is the largest cell phone company in Africa, the state company. And there's been this effort to privatize. My sense has been it's not going particularly well, and they've been changing some of the deadlines and pushing them back. Surely in part because everybody is seeing what's happening in the country, and that lowers the prices and lowers some of the bids. And that reflects directly on Prime Minister Abiy's vision, and the vision that he has put forward. If there's a struggle with one of those early steps to privatize a very prominent company. Also want to just make sure we're emphasizing this is a conversation about Tigray, but the point was made that unfortunately the violence that we're seeing in Tigray is not limited to Tigray, and there is quite significant levels of instability in parts of Oromia, Amhara, Benishangul Gumuz, even in some of the Somalia-Afar border areas. And so we do need to keep an eye on some of what's happening elsewhere in the country and the volatility there. Finally, I'll conclude with just a point about accountability and reconciliation, which is ultimately going to be so important to progress. There is going to need to be some degree of accountability for what has happened in Tigray and in some of these other parts of the country. And that is why documentation of human rights abuses and making sure that there is collection of evidence that can stand up in future legal processes if those happen is really important right now. And in so many situations like this, it gets to a point where the violence subsides and there's a real push to let's move on, especially at elite levels, and sort of, we'll deal with the past later, but we need to move on. And what I know is that many people who are victims of these abuses and human rights violations are not ready to move on and demand some degree of accountability and reconciliation as well. And those demands are deeply felt. And so I think that needs to be part of the conversation right now, even as the violence rages in some parts. And I know lots of people are focused on that, and we can't lose sight of it. So thank you again for having me. It's been a really good conversation.
Thank you so much for being with us. And maybe our next conversation will be about justice in post-conflict societies, and whether there's no justice, no peace sort of applies in post-conflict African societies too. I think how fraught the ICJ discussion has become in Africa. So maybe that's not the right forum to seek justice, but there are other formulas, as we know from Sierra Leone and other places. So I really want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm an Africanist. I've been at FIU for 30 years. If you want to have a good conversation on Latin America, come right down here to Miami to FIU, and you'll have the best conversations in the world. But sometimes we, a handful of Africanists, are a little bit lonely, and you've made me less lonely today and enriched the knowledge of our audience quite considerably. So it was very much a pleasure to have you, Ambassador Gavin, Jonas Mulatto, and John Timmon. Thank you for being with us. Ophelia might also like to say a word of farewell, but I really am grateful to you for joining us today. Ophelia, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here, Professor Clark. Thank you all for your brilliant contributions. We are truly honored to have had such a stellar panel, and Professor Clark, many thanks for being a brilliant moderator. Thank you all. We hope to see you in future conversations on this very important topic.
Thank you so much. See you all soon. Stay safe. Stay well. Cheers.
Thank you, Dr. Clark.
Bye. Take good care.